Alright guys, BLM here, and we are back with another video. In this video we'll be going over the history of Assassin's Creed Novelizations. So this video will be going over every Assassin's Creed book that ties into either a game or a movie. As of right now, there are 11 books, most of which are written by Oliver Bowden. Now there are some other books, some fully original books, like Heresy and the Last Descendant series. But I think I'm going to save those for a different video where I talk about transmedia in Assassin's Creed. So now most of these books aren't really meant to be read on their own. They're kind of like complementary to the games. Now this video will focus on the differences between the games and the novels. So expect spoilers from every game in the main series. So with that out of the way, now let's get started. So let's start off with 2009, the year that the first Assassin's Creed novelization was released, which was Assassin's Creed Renaissance, a novelization of Assassin's Creed 2. As with AC2, this story tells the story of Ezio Auditore, starting with his childhood and ending with his fight with Rodrigo Borgia. And Renaissance is a pretty straightforward novelization, though it does go out of its way sometimes to be more historically accurate, and obviously does include some extra details. Some of these details include more information on Ezio's love life, detailing some of his relationships with Christina, Rosa, and Caterina, though the Christina romance was implemented into the Christina missions in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Characters like Claudia and Annetta have more to do in this book, and they even mention Ezio's belief in Christianity at some points, despite it never being mentioned in the games. The AC2 DLCs are also detailed here before they even came out. A major change, though, within this book is the end date. The game ends in 1499, however, the book here ends in 1503, which was the year of Rodrigo Borgia's death. While this is not proven, this is my theory on why this is. My theory is that the original plan was to end the game in 1503 with the death of Rodrigo Borgia. However, late into the production of AC2, they decided to make Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, which would be a direct sequel. Now, due to their plans with Brotherhood, I think they changed the year that the game ends very late into production, which forced them to make Ezio spare Rodrigo due to historical accuracy. Now, obviously, this book was also being written during the game's development and was probably already completed by the time of Brotherhood's conception, which I think lends credence to my theory. Now, something else I should mention is that none of these game novelizations include the modern day. So all references to Desmond are eliminated, and the book ends with Minerva talking to Ezio instead of Desmond, which I do think takes away from the scene. Overall, this book is probably the one that has the least amount of changes from its original source material, and the biggest change, as I mentioned, being something that they decided to do probably at the last second. But I would still recommend Renaissance for fans of Ezio, fans of Assassin's Creed 2, but considering the minimal amount of original content within it, it's tough to recommend for everybody. Alright, now let's move on to 2010, where Ezio's story continued with the release of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. And this is another pretty straightforward novelization. However, I do feel like this book has some filler in it, which makes this book longer than AC Renaissance, despite the AC Brotherhood game being much shorter than AC2. The biggest addition to this book, and the main reason I think you would want to read it, is because it fills in the time period between Cesare's arrest and Cesare's death, detailing Cesare's escape and Ezio's searching of him. Some other details that are in the book that are missing from the games are Maria Auditore's death, which occurs after Cesare's arrest, Ezio becoming a counselor for Pope Julius II, who is Rodrigo's replacement, the details of Claudia stepping down as Madame of Rosa in Fiore and being replaced by Rosa, and the more details that were added that expanded Ezio's relationships with Machiavelli and Leonardo. However, unlike Renaissance, this book does not cover the Da Vinci disappearance, with my theory on that being because the Da Vinci disappearance was probably something created after the initial conception, meaning Bowden probably didn't have the outline for it. Overall, Brotherhood is more of the same from Renaissance. However, there is that big chunk towards the end, detailing that missing 4-year period that I would personally recommend reading it for. However, outside of that, it's pretty much a straight up novelization. Alright, that's it for AC Brotherhood, so let's move on to 2011, where Assassin's Creed actually had 2 novelizations. And we're going to start off with the finale to the Ezio trilogy in Assassin's Creed Revelations. Just like the previous books, this is pretty much a direct retelling of the events of Assassin's Creed Revelations, but again with some pretty interesting extra details. First off, the game starts with Ezio already arriving in Masyaf. However, the book adds more details to this journey and also expands on how he learned about Altair's library to begin with. Just like Brotherhood, I do feel like there's some filler in this book, with some weird retellings that didn't really need to be there. A lot of them being like tutorial missions that just seem strange in book form. The Altair memories are also in this book and play out pretty much exactly like they do in the games. Now, the ending of the Revelations game is one of my favorite moments in all of Assassin's Creed, but the book really radically alters this in a negative way by not even mentioning Desmond and having Jupiter, who's called Tinia here, talk directly to Ezio instead of to Desmond in the Sync Nexus, which I think kind of ruins a lot of the point of the story there. However, the book does not end there. The book actually continues on to detail Ezio and Sophia's return to Italy, along with their wedding, the birth of their children, and also the death of Leonardo. The ending of this book is actually a novelization of AC Embers, which was an animated short film that detailed the end of Ezio's life. And it's a pretty faithful adaptation. Overall, Revelations is pretty much the same as Brotherhood, with most of the book being a straight up novelization, but with Revelations, there's a section at the beginning and a section at the end that is filled with original content. And for massive fans of Ezio, this is kind of something you need to read at some point, considering it really details the later parts of his life. So now we're going to move on to the other book released in 2011, which is The Secret Crusade, which details the life of Altair as being told by Niccolo Polo. With the frame narrative of this book being that this is Niccolo Polo's journal that Ezio finds and reads over the course of Assassin's Creed Revelations, with the epilogue of the book being Ezio's arrival to Constantinople. The book kind of serves as a novelization of AC1, but it also tells pretty much the complete life of Altair and gives him much needed backstory. So first, the book details Altair's childhood, talking about the death of his father and expanding on his relationships with Abbas and Malik. The AC1 novelization portion of the book features very little changes from the original, most likely because the source material was already out at that point and he had a more detailed outline to work from. The book also shows a lot more of Altair's character. The game shows him to be mostly calm and rational, but the book allows him to show more of his emotions, making him feel like a real person. The novel also includes a faithful novelization of AC Bloodlines, which was a PSP game that details Altair's relationship with Maria and the start of him writing the Codex. Now, the events from Altair's life that were told in Revelations are also retold here, but this time with more details, and also the gaps are also filled in, so that's pretty cool as well. Overall, The Secret Crusade is definitely a great book for Assassin's Creed fans. It really makes Altair a much more likable character, and furthers his importance in the Assassin's Creed franchise. Now we're going to move forward to 2012, with the release of Assassin's Creed Forsaken, the tie-in novel for Assassin's Creed 3. Forsaken is universally looked at as the best book in the series. Now, this is a very interesting book, considering it's the first book in the series to actually go tell its own story, that of the life of Haytham Kenway. Though it does include some scenes from AC3, it tells them from Haytham's perspective. Like The Secret Crusade, there is a frame narrative in this book, with the book being Haytham's diary that Connor is reading after his death. The book details Haytham's childhood, giving us a lot of information on Edward Kenway as well, who would later be the protagonist of AC4, though Edward is very different in this book, a lot of it being due to the book being written way before the development of AC4. After Edward's death, the book details how Haytham became a Templar, mostly due to his relationship with Reginald Birch. The book also details how Haytham got his hidden blades, and expands on his relationship with Edward Braddock, which leads up to the novelization part of the book, where sequences 1 through 3 of AC3 are pretty much retold exactly how they happened in the game. After that retelling, Haytham's relationship with Zio is expanded on, and we follow Haytham as he returns to Europe, which leads to a major event for his character, and expands on the life of Jennifer Scott, Haytham's half-sister. The book has no details of the events of AC Rogue, obviously because AC Rogue did not exist at the time. Back third of the book is pretty much a retelling of AC3, but this time through the eyes of Haytham, only telling the events of Sequence 8 on. But before that, we do get some details on how Haytham learned about Connor being his son. The book ends with Haytham's death by the hands of Connor, and then follows Connor a little bit to retell the remaining events of AC3. But this ending is pretty fantastic, featuring two really good monologues, the first of which being Haytham's final journal entry, where he explains to Connor why he acted the way he did, and hopes for forgiveness and understanding from him. The other speech is from Connor, which was originally intended to be part of the game, but was cut for no reason, considering the audio file is in the game. The epilogue speech for Connor is so great, as it concludes Connor's character arc by showing his recognition of his failures, but also having his determination to fight for what he believes in, even though he knows that he may never win. Forsaken is probably the biggest recommendation on this list, as to me and to many other people, it is the best book in the series. With Haytham already being a great character in AC3, this further expands upon it, making Haytham one of my favorite characters ever. So that's it for AC Forsaken. Now we're moving on to 2013 with the release of Assassin's Creed Black Flag, the novelization of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. This book returns to being more of a direct novelization than the previous one, following the life of Edward Kenway. The frame narrative here is, once again, this is a journal written by Edward after his years of being a pirate. Something that's really expanded upon here in the book is Edward's life before leaving for the Caribbean, as the book starts 4 years before the events of the game. The book shows Edward meeting his first wife, Carolyn Scott, and really dives into his motivations on why he became a pirate to begin with, which are implied in the game but not really explicitly said. Most of this being due to him feeling unworthy and him not being able to find contentment. Unlike the previous books that seem to add filler to boost the length, this book does the complete opposite by eliminating a lot of the story. It eliminates the entire Nassau plotline that involves the blockade, and it eliminates some of his story with Blackbeard, like the siege of Charlestown. There are some moments from this book that still seem to be cut moments from the game, where there is a fight between Edward and El Tiburon earlier in the game, which ends with Edward's defeat, and him ending up on the ship where he meets Adewale. What's strange is that this was originally supposed to be in the game, but was cut, and instead of a full fight, El Tiburon just knocks Edward out with one hit. But still, at the end of the game, after Edward kills El Tiburon, he still makes reference to this fight, even though it never happened. Another thing that's only in the books is Edward's feelings for Mary Read and Anne Bonny, but I kind of feel like that's for the better. And there was also a scene where Edward learns about Stede Bonnet's death, but again, I don't know if that's needed. After the events of the game are retold, the book does continue to show him returning to Bristol, and does attempt to link to Forsaken, which already detailed Edward's later life. Black Flag overall is kind of a mixed bag for me. While the original content in this book is interesting, and Edward's motivations are more clearly defined, I do find this book a bit forgettable, and one that at the end of the day, I don't know if I can really recommend. However, if you are a massive Edward fan, why not just give it a shot? So now let's move on to 2014, which saw the release of 2 Assassin's Creed games, Assassin's Creed Rogue and Assassin's Creed Unity. But Unity is the only one to get a novelization here. The Unity book follows the same format as Forsaken in many ways, this time following the life of Elise de la Serre, showing her backstory and her perspective of the story, which I do think makes her a more well-rounded character and really adds a lot more perspective to the narrative of the game. Unity has the exact same frame narrative as Forsaken, with this being Elise's diary, and Arno is reading it after Elise's death. Also like Forsaken, Arno has short sections in between certain chapters to allow him to comment on what he just read. Again, like Haytham, Elise only appears for about half of the game, which leads to most of this book being original content. The book begins with Elise's childhood, showing her join the Templar Order, and also the death of her mother. This is followed by Elise's trip to London right before the events of Assassin's Creed Unity, and surprisingly connects Unity to Forsaken with the appearance of an elderly Jennifer Scott. This section of the book also details a lot of Elise and Arno's relationship. The book then retells the events of the game from Elise's perspective, giving context to what Elise was doing in between her appearances in the game, showing her trying to become the leader of the Templars after her father's death, and later showing her investigation, which includes some characters that didn't show up in the games. The book follows the events of the games pretty accurately after Elise and Arno get back together, but it does skip a couple sequences. The book ends pretty similar to Forsaken, with Arno reading a letter that Elise wrote for him right before her death, with the knowing that she was willing to die in the fight with Germain. AC Unity here is another book that I would really recommend. I actually really enjoy this book, and a lot of that comes from the fact that it pretty much mimics Forsaken in almost every single way, but this time with a less liked character in Elise. However, after reading this book, I definitely liked Elise a lot more, and it overall increased my enjoyment of Unity's story. Now we're moving on to 2015 with the release of Assassin's Creed Underworld, a partial novelization of AC Syndicate. The story primarily follows the life of Henry Green, but it does also follow Ethan Frye and Frederick Aberline. The weird thing here is that the first 2/3 of the book act as a prequel to Syndicate, being set 6 years before the events of the game and showing Henry Green's arrival in London and him living with the pseudonym of the Ghost. This also expands on his relationship with Ethan Frye, who becomes his assassin teacher. The first 2/3 of the book are rather dark, so it's pretty jarring when you get to the last third, which is a retelling of the Evie Frye section of the Syndicate storyline, which is noticeably more lighter in tone, making the book feel uneven and weird. Now, without the Jacob sections of the story, the last third goes by pretty quickly and really shines a focus on Evie and Henry's relationship, including the cutscenes that play out after you find the pressed flowers. The back third of this book, though, doesn't really add much original content, being a pretty direct novelization. Underworld for me is a pretty mixed bag. I never really cared for the book, partially due to me never really caring much about Henry Green. That being said, though, I don't mind the first half of the book, but it's really towards the second half where it starts to go a bit downhill. So we're moving on to 2016, where there was no main series Assassin's Creed game, but there was the movie. So we're going to talk about the official movie novelization, written by Christie Golden. Again, I'm not going to talk much about this considering the book is mostly faithful to the film, but it does feature side characters more prominently. It does fix some lore issues, though there are still a lot more in there, and does provide full backstories for most of the characters. This is the first and only up until this point novelization to include the modern day, while also including Aguilar's narrative, and also having some original stories with some familiar faces like Duncan Warpole, Yusuf Tazim, Baptiste, and Shao Jun. Overall, the movie novelization is pretty good, especially when comparing it to the film itself. It breaks lore less often, and is able to tell a more coherent story. However, in my opinion, that story was never good to begin with. But if you're a massive Assassin's Creed fan and you hated the movie, I would still recommend checking out the novelization. Now we're moving on to 2017 with the release of Assassin's Creed Origins Desert Oath, which was a prequel to Assassin's Creed Origins, detailing the early life of Bayek, and was actually released a few weeks before the game, allowing fans to know some of the characters before the game's release. Now this isn't a real novelization, again it's mostly an original story, but it did tie in with the game, so I decided to still talk about it. The book primarily takes place 20 years before the events of the main game and gives us a complete backstory on Bayek, including his relationship with his father, who was also a Magi, and his relationship with Aya, and eventually includes the birth of Khemu as well. Some characters from the game do appear in this story, with most of them being the people from Siwa, and this book also introduces the Order of the Ancients. Since this isn't a real novelization, there's no repeated content here, so there isn't much to compare. Overall, Desert Oath is okay. I do like that they introduced the characters of Bayek and Aya before the release of the game. However, this is another book that at the end of the day, it didn't really stick with me. So much to the point where I was just kind of on Bayek's character up until I actually played the game and really fell in love with him. However, if you are a big fan of Bayek and a big fan of Origins, this is still one you could read, and it does provide a lot of insight into a lot of concepts that show up in Origins, and a lot of concepts that end up being brought up in the Assassin Order. Now it's time for the final book at the time of this recording, moving on to 2018 with the novelization of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is the first main series book to not be written by Bowden, instead being written by Gordon Doherty. And now this is the first novel to be confirmed as canon, mostly due to the branching storyline of Odyssey. The book follows Cassandra, who is the canon protagonist, with Alexios appearing as Deimos, as he would in the game if you picked to play as Cassandra. The timeline of the book is much more realistic, taking place over the course of 10 years. Some changes from the game to the book are that Cassandra finds Icaros as a child, instead of it being a guardian sent to her by Pythagoras. The Monger captures Cassandra and brutally tortures her, which was not in the game. Really, a lot of gender-specific things happen here. Obviously couldn't be in the game due to the same script being used for both characters, but I think this really amplifies why we don't need multiple characters in Assassin's Creed. Marini is the one that kills Lagos in the book, with Cassandra pretty much having nothing to do with that entire storyline in the book, instead hearing about it later. Cassandra trains Testicles for about a year, even after she kills the Cultist King. Cassandra was also imprisoned for about a year, instead of escaping instantly like in the game. The end of the family storyline here takes place in 422 BC, ending with Cassandra killing Deimos, though Stentor, Nikolaos, and Marini remain alive. The rest of the story takes place over the course of 1 year, with Cassandra meeting Pythagoras on Thera, where he dies 3 days after handing Cassandra the staff, instead of dying instantly. Now in the book, there are no mythical creature fights, and most of the references to the Isu are omitted, with the book never referencing Aletheia, the Forge on Andros, the Olympus Project, or the modern day. The book ends with the cultist storyline, where Cassandra lets Aspasia go, mainly due to Aspasia not dying for another 20 years in real life. This is actually a book I did not read until I started doing research for this video, and I came out of Odyssey enjoying it despite not really loving the game. Though I do have minor issues here and there with certain plot things, I do think this story is more coherent than the game's narrative. And obviously if you're a massive Assassin's Creed fan, this is kind of one I need to recommend, due to the fact that this is canon while the game is not. So there we go, that is every Assassin's Creed novel that ties in with a game or film. Again, I wouldn't really recommend reading these unless you're really a big Assassin's Creed fan, considering a lot of the information on these books could be found on the wiki. The ones I personally would recommend, though, are Forsaken, Unity, and probably The Secret Crusade, as they are my 3 favorite novels. So yeah, that is every single Assassin's Creed novelization up to this point. Thank you for watching.